Hello and welcome to today's live remote session broadcast. We're talking about must-haves in developing an insider threat program that protects sensitive data. A very timely and relevant topic, especially considering some of the headlines. And I know ransomware has dominated lately, but there have been a number of headlines relating to insider threat also coming out. And I want to say thanks to Spirion for being here and being part of underwriting this kind of digital learning and collaboration. We really appreciate you for doing that. Now, I'll be your host and your moderator of today's panel discussion. My name is Bruce Sussman. I'm Director of Content here at Secure World. And those of you who know me know that I like to start with a single image whenever I can, because I think pictures are powerful. And the picture on the left of your screen right now, this is Dr. Larry Ponemon. And I was doing a fireside chat with him at Secure World Detroit, pre-COVID, obviously, when we were all together in this massive conference room. And we were talking about the insider threat. It was one of several topics we hit on. And I just want to tell you, just give you one sentence that he said back to me when I asked him about the seriousness of the insider threat. And here's the quote from Dr. Larry Ponemon of the Ponemon Institute. When companies had an insider threat, in general, they were much more costly than external incidents. This was largely because the insider threat is smart and has the skills to hide the crime for months, for years, sometimes forever. And of course, he was talking about the malicious insider threat. We know there are other types, and we're going to be unpacking that during our panel discussion today. But it's a very serious and, I believe, timely topic. So fantastic to have you with us here as we look to give you access to some great thought leadership on the insider threat. Now, today's panelists are on the screen right here, and in just a moment, I'm going to introduce them to you. They're really fantastic. Phil Curran is the CISO and CPO of Cooper University Health. Justin Turner's here. He's the Associate Director of Cybersecurity and Data Privacy from Protiviti. Billy Van Cannon's in the house. He's the head of product for Spirion. And Jordan Fisher is here. She's the cyber attorney, global leader of privacy practice group at Beckage Law. So in just a moment, panelists, I'll ask you to kind of fill in a little bit about your background and introduce yourselves as we get started with our conversation. But prior to that, I would like to let you know about a few resources. First of all, there's some great resources available in the resources tab on your screen. Also, this is designed to be an interactive panel discussion. So as we go through this time together, if you've got questions, would you throw them in the text chat box, please? And we'll get to as many of those as we can. If you need a certificate of attendance for your governing body, that will auto-populate into the certificate of attendance tab after 40 minutes time. And if you have audio or video issues, refreshing your browser can solve about 99.9% of the issues. We've discovered that through a lot of trial and error, by the way, so that should solve that for you. Lastly, this is going to be a valuable discussion. You may want to share it with a peer or a colleague, right? It will be available on demand after the fact. So we'll send you an email with a link to that. So that's just some of the best practices as we get rolling. And now, let's talk about where we are going today. We're going to do introductions first, then we're going to a time of open discussions. We'll have audience questions as well, and then we'll finally close out and talk about next steps. So that's our agenda and kind of where we're headed as we go through the next few minutes together. So at this point, it's time for some introductions and some background. And panelists, I'd like to ask you to briefly tell us a little bit about yourself and your role and your organization, but then would you also give us just a brief, high-level description on what you think about when you think about the insider threat. And so Phil Curran from Cooper University Health, I see you on the screen first. So how about we come to you first? Welcome, and thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. My name is Phil Curran. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer and Privacy Officer for Cooper University Healthcare in Camden, New Jersey. We are the only level 1 trauma center in South Jersey. If you know anything about New Jersey, there's a road 295 that divides New Jersey in half. We are responsible for the 7 southern counties. I have been doing information security for about 25 years now. I did I got started when I was in the Air Force stationed at the Pentagon, and has continued my career outside when I retired from the Air Force in 2000. I built programs, I've managed programs. From an insider threat perspective, I know that the malicious actor probably caused the most damage, but what I am most concerned about is what I call the incidental, where an individual is just trying to do the very best job that they can, but they inadvertently click on a link that loads malware onto the system, and that starts a whole bunch of other things as we go down the line. That's where my concern is. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, I appreciate that level set, Phil, and also thanks for your service and learning more about your background as well. So great to have you on the panel discussion today. Next, let's go to Jordan Fisher from Beckett Law. Welcome, Jordan.
Thanks, Bruce. Excited to be here today. So Jordan Fisher, I am an attorney at Beckett where I lead our global practice, but I also am the director for the Center for Law and Transformational Technology at Drexel University's Klein School of Law. So really get an opportunity to look at both the academic side as well as the practical side when it comes to the evolving legal regulations, requirements, policy around cybersecurity, data privacy, and technology. And so when I think about sort of insider threats, I sort of align with what Phil said, which is that inadvertent clicker. And I think education is such a key part when it comes to insider threats. It can be education around how to and how not to use the system. It's education on being aware and being able to identify issues that are happening. And that's because so many people touch our systems. They really have access into our systems. So really ensuring that all of those access points are secure and well-informed is really key. But looking forward to today's conversation.
Okay, well, fantastic. We'll appreciate all your insights. And I know you've seen a lot and done a lot in your career. So it's fantastic to have you on board, Jordan. That's great. Justin Turner is next from Protiviti. Welcome, Justin.
Yeah, Bruce, thank you for having me. So yeah, I'm Justin Turner. I'm an associate director at Protiviti in our technology consulting practice. If you haven't seen or heard from Protiviti before, we're a global consulting firm. We have over 6,000 professionals globally, 85 offices across 25 countries. I've been with the firm just over 10 years, hit my 10-year anniversary with the company last month. I've focused on security and privacy for the vast majority of those 10 years. I lead cybersecurity for our energy and utilities industry subsector as well. So some of what I cover today might be things that I'm seeing specifically in the oil and gas space or even in the manufacturing and distribution space. Also lead our industrial control system and operational technology security practice. So pre-COVID, spent a lot of time in the field with a hard hat and some steel toe boots, evaluating those risks. And there's some insider threats that proliferate down to our operations and shop floor in some of those industries. So when I think about insider threat, I have the benefit of going after two really good answers about the incidental insider threat. But I think just in general with malicious insider, it's a bit of the elephant in the room, right? And when I bring this up with clients, my clients, a lot of times the feedback that I get and what I hear is, well, and we're not real worried about that. Like, we trust our people. Like, we've got a lot of people that have been here a long time. Like, it's not something that we're significantly concerned about. And when we do activities like penetration testing and we're able to kind of identify how, pervasive user access to sensitive repositories is, or if somebody really wants to do something and has some technical tools and some know-how, what are the things they can exploit or do to elevate their permissions? And so it's definitely something that is uncomfortable to talk about at the management level, but we need it. And this is a very timely topic to be covering this. So excited to be here, honored to be here, and looking forward to the discussion today.
Well, great to have you on board, Justin, and looking forward to your unique perspectives. And that's one of the things I love about panel discussions. I mean, each of you come at this from a different angle, and that makes it so rich for those of us who are attending today. So thank you very much. All right, Billy Van Cannon from Spirion, welcome to the remote session.
Thank you, Bruce. Excited to be here today. So I'm the head of product at Spirion. I have a pretty broad security background, from running a SOC to running a certificate authority. And then I also was in charge of some PCI compliance software. So I helped millions of merchants become PCI compliant. And then I also worked on password managers and more specifically privilege access management. So I worked at Thycotic for a while and to really lock down the critical assets of a company, you know, the servers, databases, and network appliances. And now at Experian, of course, I'm really concerned about the data itself and how we discover that data and classify it so that we can understand it and protect it. You know, you can't protect what you don't know you have. And so that's definitely an aspect I think about on insider threats is, you know, how do we find that data and lock it down? And then another thing I think about is how insider threats are a people problem, way more so than a technology problem. And I'm sure when we talk about, you know, how we identify indicators of insider threats and how to prevent them, we'll get a lot more into that.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and we will definitely. We'll come back to that. So great perspectives. Thank you, Billy, and thank you, panelists, for your introductions. That just gives us a little sliver or a slice into kind of how you're approaching this challenge that we're talking about here today on the Secure World Remote session. So let's go to a quick level set now, just so we understand exactly what we're talking about. And Jordan, I thought maybe I'd come to you on this. Would you just kind of share with us how you view external versus the insider threat? And we don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but just, you know, what you're thinking as far as almost defining these terms.
Yeah, and I'm going to really define it from that sort of legal policy perspective and not necessarily from a technical perspective. But I think insider threats are people who are users of your system, so employees, contractors, individuals who have credentials to access your actual servers and systems, as compared to external threats, which are individuals that are trying to break into your system, right? They don't have permissions, they don't have access, and they're having to do it from a nefarious perspective. So I really think about it as like credentialing. Do I have credentials to gain access to this? Or am I trying to break in a sense that I don't already have a key to the building is sort of the best way that I can think about it. But I'm sure everyone sort of has different ways of sort of aligning those two different threat vectors to the business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like what you're saying, though, and I think that makes sense, and you're right. There might be some nuances here, but that's a good general overview. And I think this is a great place to do our first pulse check. And here's what I want to know. If you would you vote on this right now? And the statement is, we spend more time focused on external threats than internal. So we spend more time focusing on external threats than internal. Would you answer now, if you would? And let us know what you think. You know, do you, you know, how are you, it's on your screen right now in the Pulse Check tab. Are you spending more time on external threats than internal? And while you answer, Billy, what would you add about this definition or this thought about external versus insider?
Right. And I completely agree with Jordan, but I would just add one aspect to that. And that's when an external threat is able to socially engineer an internal person, right? Like they come in through email and they're able to convince them to click on a link and download malware or get their phishing for credentials. Then they go from being an external threat to looking like an internal threat. So a lot of the things that you want to do for your insider threat is take into account how an external threat might look like an insider. So email is a huge attack vector, and then credentials being lost. So, you know, multi-factor authentication may not sound like an insider threat protection, but if the credentials are lost, then that's your defense against somebody that looks like an insider.
Yeah, very, very good point. Okay, appreciate that add-on. That's great. And by the way, audience, I appreciate all your votes. So, you know, 37% are saying yes, we do spend more time. Actually, not 37%. It's 38 of you have voted that you spend more time focusing on external than internal threats. So almost everybody agrees with that of those of you who voted. So thank you very much for that. All right, let's go to our next area of discussion. And this one we'll unpack for a little bit here. We've got some room to breathe on this one, because this is key, I think, understanding what are the different types of insider threats, and then some of the motivations or, you know, causations linked to those. And Phil, I thought, you know, you mentioned early on what you're most concerned about, the incidental insider, I think. So maybe you want to start there, but tell us about the different types, that you track in your program.
Well, I divided into two categories. One is the incidental, and the other is the malicious actor. And like I said, I'm quite frankly more concerned about the incidental person. It's a person who, again, is just trying to do their job, and they accidentally click on an email, click on an attachment, versus the malicious actor who is deliberately trying to do something. We focus. Right now, our focus is primarily on the incidental, and like Jordan said, it's training, it's getting out there, talking to them, making sure that they understand that they are our last line of defense when it comes to protecting against these types of incidental incidents. So we don't really have anything in place for a malicious type actor.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's see, Jordan, what would you say about these different types of threats and some of their motivations? What are you thinking?
So I think, I really echo what Phil just went through, because I think what a lot of dialogue is around sort of that accidental actor, right? I didn't mean to click on the link. I had no nefarious purpose. I just didn't recognize it. I didn't have my third cup of coffee that day or something along those lines. But I do think it is important to recognize that there are sometimes employees that have a nefarious, reason behind what they're trying to do. They're disgruntled. They have been let go, but it's in that 2-week time period where they still have access to the system, or they've been let go and haven't been appropriately been offboarded, meaning that they determine there's still access on their phone, or they had access to a social media account that they were managing that wasn't removed. And then you start to see sort of actions being taken. So when I think more about the sort of disgruntled employee, I think it's making sure that managers are aware of who has access to what, and whether that access has sensitivity to both the business or from a personal information, sensitive information perspective, and that they are monitoring to the extent allowed and appropriate how that user is using the system. And then when you are considering that an employee needs to be either let go or the employee has informed you that they're leaving, it's really locking that system down and minimizing the employee's ability to take data as they go, to plug in that USB drive and download all the medical records, which are things that we've seen before, et cetera. So I think it's just really being aware of access controls, and then management really communicating with IT and the other departments to make sure that that offboarding is done in a way that minimizes the risk of an employee taking something that they wouldn't want. So it's really looking at those controls that you have in place and testing them, monitoring them, auditing them to say, are we in fact shutting down access in a way that's appropriate to the employee's own access as they're here, and then making sure they're not taking anything with them.
Mm-hmm. And Jordan, do you think, just as a little follow-up, you mentioned employees leaving. Do you believe that's a higher risk time for some sort of insider threat activity?
I think yes, in the context where an employee is leaving not of their own volition. And I think that's where we do tend to see the taking of data, the taking of access keys, shared passwords, those types of things to administrative accounts. That's when you want to be changing the passwords that they might have had access to, making sure their access isn't there. I think that's a critical time period, whether it's a 30-minute time period or 2 weeks, whatever your policy is on sort of offboarding employees. But I think that's where you really need to focus on locking down the system.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Great. Thank you for that clarification. That's excellent. Okay. Let's go to our next area of discussion, indicators or warning signs of an insider threat. And of course, this is kind of where the rubber meets the road, right? We want to be able to, be alerted to and know that these signs are blinking at us and it's something that we should be observing. So second, Justin, would you be willing to start on this one with some ideas around indicators or warning signs?
Yeah, for sure. So I think you almost have to back up for a second and understand what are our capabilities to establish a normal user baseline, right? So I work with a lot of organizations that maybe don't even have the technology or the mapping or insights to be able to say, yeah, I mean, these are the things that Bruce does every day. This is not outside of what his regular or normal job function is. So the first thing we need to do is we need to be able to understand what is normal user baseline activity that aligns with what their job function and their job responsibilities are, right? Because then we're able to identify what the deviations are from that. Because really, when you're looking at insider threat, you're really, one of your key warning signs is going to be, this is something that doesn't normally happen, right? Billy doesn't normally log in at this time. Things like, hey, this is a mass transit of data, transfer of data, 50 gigs to removable media, or they've never accessed this cloud file repository before, right? Like, we've never seen them log into Dropbox. They're logging into Dropbox at this hour, and then they move this data. We maybe don't even know what the data is or need to know, but that might be an indicator that there's something happening outside of what we would normally expect, right? So I think that's a big key to being able to identify the warning signs. It's a foundational element that, I think unfortunately is not in place at a lot of organizations, and looking at user behavior activity and analytics is an important foundational component in being able to add on there.
Yeah.
The other thing Jordan mentioned about getting into the HR indicators, right? HR can give us some good insights there as well. And it may not just be terminations. It's when folks have put in a notice that they're leaving, and they may be leaving on good terms, but we want to make sure they're not taking something that might be IP or capital, that especially if they're leaving to a competitor or someone else in the industry. And then we also, there's in more advanced organizations, I've seen things where HR might even notify IT or security about when someone's been passed over on a promotion, right? And that they were maybe expecting to get. They've expressed to their management or to coworkers about being disgruntled. You'll see them put like a watch or some heightened activity around. Maybe we're not removing any access or blocking anything, but we're paying a little more attention to zeroing in and zooming in on those users and what they're doing to ensure that there's not anything that's going outside of what their typical user activity or their job responsibilities are.
Yeah, great. Okay, Jordan, he mentioned you. Do you want to tag on to this one?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add, when he was talking about sort of understanding users' normal course of business within the system, I think that also is asking users how they need to use the system. Because one of the insider threats is that they need to get something to a client, or they need to get something out the door, and they can't send it via email, and so they go create a Dropbox account, right? That's an insider threat, because they just went ahead, created sort of the shadow IT in order to do a workaround. So part of sort of, and I love that, baselining what is a normal user's sort of course of business, part of that is also having the conversation with the business units of how do you need to use the IT, so that we can give you secure options and you don't go and create the shadow IT that then could create that insider threat inadvertently. So I think I just wanted to add on to that. I think that it's important to have those conversations. How do you need to use the system? How are you using the system? Because all of that's going to help give IT that insight to be able to identify any insider threats.
Yeah, really interesting point on the shadow IT, which we know exploded, right, with work from home and how suddenly that happened now, what was that, 18 months ago. But Phil, I'm wondering, as Jordan kind of talked about, that Dropbox example of something that's kind of, incidental, are there other things that you see from the incidental insider and warning signs that people are just trying to get their job done maybe, but taking shortcuts they shouldn't?
Well, that's hard to say. From my perspective, quite frankly, because I don't really have a lot of tools in place. The best tool that I had to do any monitoring for any type of insider threat is a product called Fair Warning. But from an incidental standpoint, other than monitoring what's going on the firewall, monitoring what's going on our IDS log, I don't, not really know.
Okay. All right. Yeah, fair enough. Okay. Appreciate that follow-up. All right. Let's go to our next question then. And this one, I thought, Billy, if you would, perhaps you would lead this off. How do you detect an insider threat among employees with access to sensitive data? So this is, they're getting close to probably what helps make your company, right? Or, keeps it in business by keeping it private and secure. So what are you thinking about this question?
Right. I think that whether you're looking at a privacy framework or a security framework, they all start out with identifying your key assets. And a lot of people used to think of it as a network that I would wall off. And then when Zero Trust came along, we said, okay, now we're going to protect every asset and only trust people that can log into that specific asset. And people discovered we just don't have the resources to implement Zero Trust everywhere, right? That's an evolution. It's obviously important, but I think it's going to take people a long time to get there. So I think it's key to go in and actually scan the data. So a lot of times when people start out, they send out questionnaires, right? HR gets a questionnaire, finance gets a questionnaire, and tell us where your data is and how it's being used. Whereas if you go in with a scanner, you're going to find it definitely. A lot of people aren't going to know where it's at, or they're just going to forget about parts. If they're malicious insiders, they're certainly not going to fill out the questionnaire that said, I just downloaded it to my laptop. And I think a huge part of that scanning, too, is scanning the laptops. With the remote access, a lot of people are now both, from a malicious standpoint and from an incidental standpoint, the laptop is going to be their key access point to your data, right? So they're going to download the information, they're going to exfiltrate it through email or through a thumb drive, and then the incidental employee, the person that's just trying to do their job and they're tired of trying to get the data every day, so they just load it, the 10,000 Social Security numbers into an Excel file onto their laptop. And so if you're able to scan that laptop and make sure that that data is there and you can address it, you can approach them if you feel it's malicious, or if you can just ask them, and find out, oh, I'm just doing my job and I'm just tired of downloading it every day. So I think that's a key aspect to it. I think that also, by scanning it, you also have a lot of other advantages to it. You can map out the data flow. So like, for example, PCI, you want to follow the data from where it comes in to when you delete it. So that can help. By scanning all your assets, you can help map that out. And then once you do have it mapped out, you can watch for other areas, like it starts showing up in some other place. Is it because somebody's moving it there? Or is it because, an application with a service account is pulling that data over there and it shouldn't be? That kind of thing. Then the last thing is to be able to watch it, right? Putting in place, once you discover this data and especially unstructured data like files, being able to see who's accessing it and how often. Is there data in there that nobody's accessing? Maybe you should delete it so that you don't have to worry about it. Are people, all of a sudden, somebody is accessing the data more often who they normally wouldn't? Getting back to Justin's point on baselining it. That's a great thing to monitor and then push into a SIM or an analytics tool so that you can watch for indicators such as that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Those are all great suggestions. And Jordan, what do you think about this question? Detecting an insider threat among employees, because I know you deal a lot with employees who handle sensitive data.
Well, I think my first thing is clearly defining for the company what is going to be considered sensitive data. Is it sensitive personal information? Is it business sensitive information? Is it personal information that has heightened regulatory requirements on it? Or is it data that we don't have those heightened obligations, either contractually by a client or because of the regulations? And this is where I find oftentimes companies are not as clear, both with their employees and with their access controls, because they haven't taken the time to really understand what data do we have and where is it triggered as being sensitive, either, again, from that business perspective or personal information. So we really try to work to set in place that framework of what are we going to consider being sensitive? What are we going to, what does the law say is sensitive? California Consumer Privacy Act has just updated their definition of sensitive personal information to be much broader, which means are we then making sure that our monitoring of what is sensitive data is mapping to the CCPA? So that's really, we really start with what is the data and how do we want to protect the data and who really needs access to that data, because that's going to help us to create the technologies that are going to detect who is accessing it and where it's being moved. The other thing I'll say too is we often want to put around geolocation around that data so it doesn't move across borders. So oftentimes a lot of the detection we're looking at is our employees moving data to countries that we're not comfortable with, because that could also demonstrate some type of insider threat, or they're moving it across borders. So that's really what I'm thinking of when I see this question. It is, what is sensitive data? How do we set up those parameters that align with regulatory, contractual, and other obligations?
Yeah, very interesting. And I, as you were describing too, the way things continually change, it reminds me of, a lot of CISOs that I've talked with said, our incident response plan, for example, and all of that needs to be a kind of a living, breathing document. And I guess it's the same idea here for, protecting against the insider threat. You need something that moves with either the technology or the policy or et cetera, et cetera. So that's really, really good. Phil, what would you like to tag on here? And you may be on mute.
This is where technology can help. But like Jordan said, the data has to be identified first, right? What is sensitive data? Then there's technology out there that will allow you to scan across your entire environment looking for that data, and will tell you where that data is and who's been accessing it, when they've been accessing, what they've been doing with it. But it has to be combined with that information of identifying what that data is, and that's up to the business to decide. That's not an IT thing. That is a business decision.
Excellent. Yeah, great point of clarification. That's excellent. Thank you, Phil. And Justin, I hate to leave you out on this question. What would you like to add here?
So I think there's a couple things. Really like everything everyone said so far. It really aligns with kind of what my methodology has been in approaching this. We define what's sensitive by sourcing that, from the organization and from the business. And then before we even start scanning, you talk to the business to understand where the data should be, right? So we're defining what's sensitive. How do you use it? Where should it live? And then if you have that context, then if you're running technical scans, you now have something to compare it to, right? We know where it should be. The scanner will tell us where it shouldn't be or where we didn't expect, maybe a legacy process with some old data. Then we can go back to the business and say, you told us it was in these 2 folders. We found it in 2 additional folders. How do you want to proceed here? Do we lock it down? And this is where our retention requirements come into place as well, right? Setting your data retention. If it's old, we may be able to, per our retention schedule, we may be able to get rid of that data. And there's benefit in, if we keep everything forever, we have to protect everything forever. So limiting the amount of acreage that we're building this fence around is one of the mitigating strategies here, with whether we're talking about credit card data or with PCI, or we're talking about sensitive personal information or PII with some of the laws and regulations that Jordan mentioned.
Yeah, very, very good point. Good point. And Jordan, I know you had one last thing you wanted to add on this before we move on.
Yeah, so I just want to pick up a theme that Justin and Phil both mentioned, and that is this is not an IT problem. This is an organization-wide problem. And it really, the business units themselves have to own the types of data, the access, their employees. They're going to be the first line of defense to seeing something that might be an anomaly or outside the norm, and they're the ones that have to be part of the discussion. So I think sometimes we sort of expect the IT department to own this, but it's really a joint owned problem that everyone needs to be working together. And I really liked it. Justin and Phil both had those themes, and I just wanted to highlight it for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
There's
very good. Okay.
CISOs and CIOs that are virtually high-fiving you right now, Jordan, I imagine.
Exactly. If we could only do that in person, but someday we'll be able to do that again. Okay, great. Thank you all for unpacking that question. Let's go on to our next question right now. I would like each of you to kind of share either a real life example or a real life scenario of insider threats. I call them damaging insider threats, but this could be something that puts the organization at risk. That could be also a damaging insider threat potentially, right? So what's either a real life example or a scenario that you're worried about relating to insider threat? And Jordan, you went last, so how about you just kick this one off?
Sounds good. So I'll use an example that I'm aware of a long time ago, but I think it's still really relevant, where an employee was emailing about an upcoming event with an outside event planner. And the employee was asked to send a list of the employees that will be attending with sort of yes, no on a few things, timing and everything like that. And so the employee took an employee list that existed and sort of used that as a starting point and emailed it to the event planner. And on that employee list was every single employee's social security number. And that ultimately resulted in a breach that was notifiable because of the jurisdiction they were in, the types of data that were included, and the fact of who had access to it. And I think it's a great example where this employee was just, we all have done it, right? Copy and paste. We've all used a prior document, leveraged it. You said, look, we can streamline this, we can get it done. And I think there was a couple of sort of issues. One, there wasn't scanning for social security numbers in attachments before they were sent out in email, right? And there are technologies that can be scanning your emails to try to prevent something like this from happening. And two, the employee really had never had any education around looking at documents, ensuring there's no sensitive information or anything else like that. And so I think it's a really simple thing, because I think all of us sitting here are probably thinking, I have reused a document and I have sent that document out and maybe not been as careful as possible. But I think it's a good example because it resulted in a legally defined breach, which had all of the ramifications of that. Complete inadvertent error, and I think just lack of education, lack of tools being appropriately set up to prevent that from happening. So that's my sort of scenario that I wanted to share.
Yeah, that is, and that's one that makes you squirm in your seat a little bit, because that's, okay. Thank you for sharing that one, Jordan. Let's go around the horn then and see what else we've got. So I'll come to you in just a second, Phil, but Justin, you want to go next? What's either an example or a scenario?
Yeah, so real world example from maybe about a month ago, 6 weeks ago. It really kind of, I guess, again, along this line of, the incidental threat, and this even bleeds into users' personal lives as well, right? So we talk about doing things on your work asset to secure, but there's some things that could bleed over from the way that you manage IT systems and applications personally as well. So this is an organization that's considered critical infrastructure in the U.S. So they've got plant operations. They had a user who apparently had like a Chrome extension password manager on their personal computer. That personal computer got infected with some form of malware or ransomware, was able to take a password from their password manager that they were using in their Chrome browser extension that happened to be the same password they were using for their Active Directory account in their company, right? So the CISO gets a call from the FBI and says, hey, this user's credential was just sold on the dark web. We had a notification about it. And through their investigation, they found out that it really wasn't a breach of their IT infrastructure and anything they manage, but you're allowing Chrome extensions, right? And people are signing into their browsers in both environments. And that's a way that, again, kind of clicking a malicious link or downloading something that was malicious on a personal machine was able to bridge over. They were able to mitigate that, but this was a user who had very high level privilege access in the engineering side and in the operations side. So again, you're talking about potential nation state actors that have a motivation to attack U.S. critical infrastructure. So very much it was a really eye-opening example for me, and I've shared it in a number of different places for, just thinking about user education really stems beyond just, the hours of 8 to 5, right, and business hours. And there are certainly scenarios that can have an organizational impact as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's very serious, especially when you talk about, the industry they're in and how critical they are. And I mean, obviously, for all of us, our industry is what's critical to us, right? Our role, our company, et cetera. So, Justin, thank you for that great example. Okay, Phil, what's either an example or a scenario that, that worries you?
So I'll use an example that happened a few years ago in our graduate medical education office. We are a teaching institution, so we have residents. And the graduate medical education office, they are responsible for monitoring all of the residents. And one of the tools that they use, or that they used to use, was a spreadsheet that contained a lot of personal information about those residents, including date of birth, social security number. One of the people that worked in the GME office, in violation of corporate policy, copied that spreadsheet down to a USB flash drive that was unencrypted, and it subsequently lost that flash drive. So we had to notify our 250 residents that their personal information may have been compromised. So that cost us physical dollars, but it also cost us reputational-wise for our residency program for 2 or 3 years, because now residents that would want to come to Cooper would think twice about coming to Cooper because we lost personal data.
Wow, yeah,
That's my story.
I'm glad you brought up the reputational impact, right, from the insider threat, even if it's the incidental insider. So that's a great illustration, and yeah, that's tough. All right, thanks, Phil, for sharing that. Okay, so Billy, what is your example or your scenario?
I'll share one that a customer shared with me. I think it was public, so I'm not out of turn here, but I'll still speak about it generically. But it's a good example of both technology and human mistakes. So over a break, the organization was broken into, and 10 laptops were stolen. And at first glance, they thought everything was fine because the laptops had safe passwords, and the hard drives were encrypted. So yay, we stopped it. And then on further investigation, they found that all those laptops were backed up onto an external hard drive that was sitting next to them, and it was stolen with them. And that external hard drive was not encrypted. So they had to dig into it, and found thousands of instances of personal information of employees. But then when they started searching through it, they're like, wait, not all these employees are at this organization. There's employee information from organizations in Kentucky and Tennessee and all over the country. And what had happened is employees had worked at these other organizations, collected data for whatever reason. They were, collecting data on their fellow employees and other people. And they brought that with them and stored it on their laptops at the current organization. So now not only were they have to go out and notify, their own employees and the PII that was lost there, they're notifying employees at other companies because that information was brought. So that's, the policies have to be clear on the education, on the information that you should have at all, let alone stored on your laptop. And then, of course, there's the technical issues of, well, we did a good job backing it up, but we didn't encrypt the backup, and we didn't keep it separate. So,
wow. Yeah, that's a great example. That's a great example. I have to say all 4 of you brought a very unique and different example to the table, but I think it drives home the importance of talking about this, of, focusing on this type of thing and preparing for it, right, to try and mitigate that risk. And that leads us nicely to our next question, which is really what types of defense and response strategy or programs do you recommend, right? Like how are we thinking about this or doing this? So Justin, would you be willing to kick us off on this question?
Yeah, let me do that and try to, not go over too much that we've covered already, because there's been a lot of solutioning we're kicking around. And also, I don't want to steal too much thunder from everyone else. So to kind of tie everything together, right, I think what I've heard today is kind of user training and awareness is probably the #1 thing that we can be doing if you're not already investing heavily in that space, right? So if we think about our security program of our organization as this triad of people and process and technology, right? It's a 3-legged stool. In any one of those, right, we kick one of those legs out and we've kind of lost everything, right? So we can invest a lot in technology. We can define our processes. If we don't educate our users, right, on how to recognize a phish, right? How to not change wiring instructions just because we get an email, even if it's from a legitimate vendor. We got to assume that maybe they've been compromised, right? So if we're not educating our users on how to spot that curveball, then if we're kicking out one leg of the stool, the user leg has got one of the bolts is missing and the other one's already loose, right? Like that's the path of least resistance for an attacker. And That's where we're kind of bridging the world between the external and the internal threat. And then the other thing that I'll add on that I mentioned earlier around, baselining user activity and securing our sensitive data, right? Defining what is sensitive, understanding where it is, restricting even internally user access to that data, right? We can't just no longer assume, well, if it's inside and we're protecting it, we can let anybody that's on the inside have access to that data, right? We need to be limiting to, if we've got repositories that have sensitive customer information, there's going to be a limited number of folks that have a business need to be able to access and manage that data. And so we should be looking at identifying those and then locking them down as restrictive as possible. And there's always going to be folks that have access to it, but we're now limiting our attack surface, limiting the potential exposure for the insider threat if we've reduced the number of insiders that would be able to exploit that sort of a threat. So I'll kind of pause there and let others chime in.
Yeah, that's great. Well, appreciate that, and those are great insights and points that you make. So thank you, Jordan. What would you like to tag on to this question?
Yeah, and I'll admit my anxiety is still pretty high from listening to those scenarios, so I've got to pull myself down for a second. So I would say sort of picking up on that training thread, which I don't think we can say enough about training. I mean, all of us on this call, frankly, could probably use training as well since this world's changing so quickly. But one of the things, in addition to training the employees, is to get them to be involved in the conversation, get them to own their own defenses, because if they're training themselves, one, it's going to be a much more customized training to the type of data they're using, their business operations, their systems. And then two, they're going to have buy-in. They're going to want to defend their systems and their data because they're going to understand that risk. It's a big ask because I think a lot of business units are tentative around IT. I think a lot of business units, there's been this perception it's an IT problem, so they don't have to focus on it, and nobody wants to add one more responsibility to what is increasingly a long list of responsibilities. But I do think getting each employee to own their own security, to own their own privacy, is probably one of the most valuable things you can seek to obtain. And really is what's going to be the strongest defense when it comes to these insider threats.
Okay, yeah, very good. Well, and Phil, you mentioned at the very beginning, education as a key piece here. Anything you're thinking on this? What you recommend or strategies?
I think we need to know where our data is. That's critical. And then part of this was mentioned. As part of the presentation is get rid of the data that you don't need. If you have data that you don't need, you're just exponentially expanding your threat landscape. And again, like Jordan said, the business needs to be involved. The business from the highest levels, from the CEO down, needs to understand that risk and security are theirs. They don't belong to the IT department. It took me a long time to convince our business units that they are responsible, and even our CEOs realize that they're the ones that are on the hook for this. I think getting the business involved is critical.
Yep, it definitely is. That's great. Okay, really appreciate that, Phil. Billy, what are you thinking on this question?
Yeah, I think a lot of times we turn to technology, but kind of taking a step back and like how we build this team. Like the first thing, right, you have to have executive buy-in, because that's the only way you're going to get the resources and the access and the push, right, the prioritization of your program. And the next thing, it has to be cross-functional. Of course, you have to have your legal involved. You have to have the CISO. But I think one thing we've been touching on quite a bit is HR, and they're really going to be key, because when we start looking into like how do we set up defenses and things to look for. So we mentioned, when somebody's going to leave, it's one thing to zoom in when they're on that last 2 weeks, but maybe we should take a step back and look at what they did the last 90 days, because they knew they were going to leave way before that. HR can help out by looking for people who are vocally upset, people who just had a bad performance review. They can look out for, and it might be a little trickier, but people who are suddenly in financial distress, or one day they show up in their Ferrari, like, all of a sudden there's like a windfall. And then in the processes, there's a lot of things like on your critical assets. Can you set up dual access so that more than one person can access it? This is from my PAM days of, you either need to get permission to log into that critical database or two people have to do it. There's things such as a separation of duties. So the classic example is a person in accounts payable can't both set up the account and write checks to it, right? So by separating that, you're setting up a process which helps reduce the insider threat. Things like forced vacations. So, a lot of times if somebody's got a good scam going, they can't leave because if they step back and somebody else fills in, they might realize what's going on. And that's how a lot of insider threats have been discovered in the past. So I look at this and we talk about, we need executive leadership. We need the business people to help out, but the HR can unify those processes across those teams and also help look for those indicators.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I love the fact they can't leave. They're trapped because they're running their scam. That's hilarious and sad at the same time, right? So that's very interesting. Okay, great. Really appreciate everyone's thoughts on this. I do have a few questions. We don't have time for a lot of audience questions. We're going to try and answer those questions in text chat. But Jordan, I was curious about this question for you. Shannon asked, what about insider threats related to system availability, where a disgruntled employee is more interested in disrupting operations instead of stealing data? So what, have you seen scenarios like that, or what do you think about a situation like that?
Yes, I think that certainly those scenarios exist. I think they're less common in the sense that typically employees are looking to monetize. Disgruntled employees looking to monetize. It's harder to monetize disruption of your operations. That's really just someone who just wants to maybe burn the house down before they leave type of approach, and it's not as common. But I think the same, techniques that we've talked about for addressing insider threats in that context would be applicable. What changes about that, it doesn't really change anything, because if you steal data, that's stealing, right? Is that you then have some more criminal prosecution, different ways of approaching this that might be pertinent. But we've certainly seen disrupting operations, and sometimes where they're disrupting operations to then take data and sort of to then leverage that data. So they're trying to change sort of where data is going. That would be considered disrupting operations. So I don't really see a significant difference between the two when it comes to approach and sort of how you address it. But I think my fellow panelists might have more to say on that.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point, and I really appreciate that. Actually, I want to move to the next question quickly from Thomas, which was around kind of accidentally releasing or leaking data. And Justin, I saw that you were answering his question, which is this: do printers and scanners have a hard drive that's not encrypted? So if the unit's retired, right, you're getting rid of it, sensitive data can inadvertently be released. And Justin, how would you respond briefly to that question?
Yeah, so two things. One, I've mounted drives on those printers before, especially if it's something that's like in an HR area, to prove that sensitive data is there. And a lot of times those come shipped with a very basic password or no authentication at all. So potential path that if you're on the inside of the net, inside of the network, you may be able to get sensitive data off of that printer. So they are sometimes inherently insecure. But those hard drive, the bigger kind of industrial printer, copier, fax machines, those hard drives, a lot of times we're working with a vendor who kind of retires and refreshes those. We should ensure that in our contracting and our agreement with them that they're destroying the hard drive from there or wiping it, and we're getting some certificate that that's been completed, right? So if we're not going to do that ourselves and degauss it, we should ensure that they're providing that service as part of the overall contract around those printers.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, great. Appreciate that. All right, I'm going to do our final pulse check right now. And I would like you to give me a thumbs up if you think we need more emphasis on addressing the insider threat. Like if at your organization, feel like, yes, we can do more around the insider threat. So thumbs up or thumbs down on that one for the pulse check right now. And panelists, as we do that, I would like you, if you would, to give us some final closing thoughts. So let's see, Billy, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to Jordan, and then Phil, and then Justin, we'll let you wrap it up. So Billy, what are your final thoughts on this topic, or key takeaways you'd like to leave us with today?
Sure. One thing is UEBA, so user entity, analytics, behavior analytics. I think that it's really got had a trouble taking off. It was a really big thing a while ago, but the people start implementing them and they just get overrun with false positives. And I think that should not discourage, false positives shouldn't discourage us trying to attempt this anyway, right? Because if people feel like that they can just get away with anything because people have given up, then obviously that's going to bring up some issues on its own. Whereas if you have a team in place and they're just as best as they can filtering it out, it doesn't have to be from UEBA, but you have the analytics that you're looking for, strange behavior, or you get these indicators like somebody's upset or whatever. Just go ahead and follow up with people once in a while. And it's going to take a dedicated team that has the bandwidth to do that. But just by letting people know that you have a team that's looking, and that's aware of what you're doing, that'll at least knock down the opportunists, right? Maybe the hardcore upset person it's not going to affect, but keeping people aware, and that can even help against a lot of the incidental, right? Like, oh, that person called me the other day because I just downloaded, a million social security numbers. Maybe this time I better not do that so I don't show up on their list.
That's a really good point. I mean, I was just thinking about that in like a driving context. I know where the police sit, right? Like on my way to the Secure World podcast studio, right into our offices. In those areas, I'm definitely making sure I'm closer to the speed limit. You know what I'm saying? So that thought can make a difference. All right. Great closing comment. Thank you. Okay, Jordan, what would you leave us with today?
So I feel like I'm a little bit of a broken record, and I'm just going to pick up on that theme of awareness, but just keeping this top of mind, training, doing those phishing exercises, following up on those phishing exercises. So if someone doesn't pass a phishing exercise, they've got to be told that, right? Because often, we'll do the phishing exercise, but then there's no next step to it. So I think it's keeping it top of mind and then training and really explaining why. Why is this important? Why are we talking about this? Why is this something that we believe is an initiative that all of us should take time to focus on? Is really going to be important. So that training piece, it's the biggest bang for your buck, I feel, in today's world.
Excellent. All right. Great, Jordan. Thanks so much. And now, Phil, what are your final thoughts here?
Well, Jordan stole my thunder about the education, but I'll just continue to say hammer away at the business is key. Getting the business involved is key to the program.
Yep, makes sense. It sure is. And several of you have hit on that theme today, that you've got to have the business not only bought in, but part of, identifying what is even the sensitive data that we really need to protect. So that's all very relevant. Great. Justin, you get the final word here. What are you thinking?
Yeah, so if we're going to put the cherry on top of user training, right, on that Sunday, I would say let's also make sure our users know what any cyber event looks like and what might be indicative of cyber threat. And, we do have our tools, but that user eye can also be something that helps us identify when something's not right. So ensuring that users know what to look for and have the appropriate escalation paths, right? If they see something that looks suspicious, right, a lot of times we're polling folks and they say, yeah, if I saw that, I'd call someone in IT, or I'd send an email to IT. Okay, well, who, right? Like, do we have a defined escalation path? Do you know who your contact is? Because seconds might matter in the event of a real incident that could be, an insider threat. So educating users on what are the specifics of our organization, right? What are the things that we're considering sensitive, and what tools are at your disposal to avoid the accidental disclosure, right? If we need to send something securely, did you know we have encrypted email options, and here's how to use those, and here's training if you need help on that. So that's kind of the last thing that I would leave with. But a lot of good stuff discussed today.
Yeah, for sure. And I want to say thank you, Justin from Protiviti, Jordan from Beckett's Law, Billy from Spirion, and Phil from Cooper University Health. Thank you so much for being here on the panel today. We really appreciate you guys.
Thanks a lot.
So that was a great conversation, and I appreciate you voting in the pulse checks today as well. The vast majority of you, almost everybody, said yes, we should be doing more around the insider threat. And hopefully you walk away with some great tools today, right, and thoughts about what to do. Remember to check out the resources tab. That's something that you can check out for some great resources that will help you. I also want to remind you that Spirion actually has a Bright Talk channel for more data privacy and security content. They've got some great resources on there, so be sure and check it out. And I want to say thank you again, not only to our panelists, but also to Spirion for making today possible. Now, coming up, we've got some excellent webcasts on the way. We're talking about ransomware on the 29th, so that's coming up tomorrow. We're looking at 31 leak sites and 2,600 victims, so that's going to be a really interesting one. We've also got a people-centric security for healthcare compliance and risk mitigation webinar coming up on the 30th, so that's later this week. Then we look ahead to a masterclass on cybersecurity with Roger Grimes, teaching data-driven defense. And I also want to let you know about something that we've just announced, which is a Secure World Plus course coming up. This will be happening in December. It's a one-day course. It's about developing a comprehensive ransomware plan, and that earns 5 CPE credits, and it's a great piece of continuing education, so check that out. And the last thing I'll mention is something that I host weekly, which is our Secure World Sessions podcast. And our latest episode just published this morning, and it's related to a fireside chat that I did for the virtual Secure World Great Lakes last week. It is an interview that I was privileged to do with the Assistant Director of the United States Secret Service. And we were talking about the evolution of ransomware. And I don't know about you, but I think of like the Secret Service, like, aren't they the guys with sunglasses and the earpieces and they're running around with the president, right? And they're on all the TV shows like that. They have deep cyber involvement as well. And just a really great conversation on how their role and mission has evolved and the things that organizations, whether government or private, can be doing now to mitigate against the ransomware risk. So check that out on today's podcast. Just search Secure World by opening your podcast app. And last thing, thank you again to Spirion, and thank you for being here as we talk about must-haves in developing an insider threat program that protects sensitive data. That's it from today for the live broadcast. Remember, this will be available on demand, and you'll get an email telling you, where that can be found, and then you'll also have an ability to share that with others as well. So thanks for being here. We'll catch you next time on the Secure World Remote Sessions. Take care.